Good morning and welcome to Community Roundtable, a free public service brought to you on AM 1590 KDJS. If you're a member of a nonprofit organization and would like to be featured on the program, call the KDJS Newsline at 320-235-2900. That's 320-235-2900.
Well, today we're talking about chronic wasting disease with deer. A lot of deer hunters around our Wilmer, west central Minnesota area. On the line is Wildlife Research Manager with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Lou Cornacelli. Lou, thanks for taking some time here as we record our show. You're in the middle of traffic, just kind of hanging out, waiting for an accident to clear, huh? How's it going for you?
It's going pretty slow. Yeah, this winter has been a challenge. I tell colleagues that usually you sail right into work, but this winter's been a little bit more difficult.
Especially lately.
Yeah, and we're supposed to get more.
Lots of white stuff, for sure, gosh. Amidst all the white stuff are deer, and man, you know as well as we all do here in the Wilmer area, lots of deer hunters around, and gosh, chronic wasting disease is going to be our topic of the morning here, I think, because it was something that was in Wisconsin, if I've got the time frame right, and then southeast Minnesota, and now a deer found north of Brainerd, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's been in Wisconsin for a long time, northeast Iowa for not as long, but long enough, and we found it first in the southeast in 2016, and now we found a CWD positive adult female in Crow Wing County in north, just near Merrifield, near the captive cervid facility we were doing surveillance around. So it's going to be an interesting next few years, I think.
Yeah, and not only the upper Midwest here, but I guess up into Canada and a little bit out in the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, the disease was first described and likely originated in the Intermountain West, Colorado, Wyoming, and it's spread over the last 50 years. Certainly naturally in a lot of the western state, a lot of the West, but transported in trucks to the Midwest and then spread both naturally and in trucks. So it varies how states become infected. But the bottom line for us is that when you find an infection, the last thing we want to do is leave this legacy of disease on the landscape. And you keep talking about deer hunters. We have 500,000 deer hunters in this state. It's a $1 billion industry, give or take. And when you deal with a disease that doesn't have a cure, that you see in other states how it spreads, we just do what we can not to be there, and it's difficult to do.
How would you describe what chronic wasting disease is?
Well, it's a prion disease, so it's basically a malformed protein, and these proteins exist in everybody, and there's something that causes that protein to misform and cause a brain disease. It's a neurodegenerative brain disease, and eventually the animal dies. There's a human disease for listeners who want to look it up. It's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and it's fairly rare, but it's also a prion disease for which, again, there's no cure. And what happens is it's very persistent in the environment. It's not a bacteria or a virus. You can't kill it by bleaching it or cooking it out or sunlight or cold or heat. So once it gets in the environment and the disease becomes really established in wildlife populations, it's impossible to eliminate because you can't treat it. So what we do is basically look at it from the perspective of preventative medicine. And if you find something early, then there's a lot of things you can do right off the bat to try and eliminate it. If you find it and you wait, then we know what the outcome looks like, and that's long-term negative trends in deer populations. So that's kind of the nutshell on the disease. There's a lot of information online. Some of it's basement level stuff, but there's a lot of good information online on prion diseases and what states are dealing with.
Has this been found in elk and moose? Any other kind of animals similar?
It has. It's the disease of the cervid family. So deer, elk, moose, reindeer, caribou, it can potentially infect all of those animals. In Minnesota, obviously, we have mostly white-tailed deer, so that's where our infection lies. We do test the few elk that we harvest, and we also test the moose when we can, and we haven't found and eat two species. So for us, it's really just white-tailed deer right now.
What I'm wondering, other people are too probably, when we get the story of the wayward moose that wanders south and associated with disease a lot of time, but we don't know what. Could that be CWD, or is that something different?
No, it's something different. It's typically brainworm. Brainworm's another neurological disease caused by by a worm. And almost all white-tailed deer carry it. It's that the worm evolved with whitetail, so they pretty much just a pass-through species. But that worm has clinical effects on both elk and moose. So usually, you often see animals do goofy things. They're typically young males that are emigrating from where they were born. But every once in a while it happens, and the animal also has brainworm. There was one. Oh my gosh, it's probably 6, 7, 8, maybe more years. No, more than that. Maybe 10 years ago, that was around Sleepy Eye, I think. A young male, and that one turned out to have brainworm. It had died on the person's lawn and was diagnosed with that. So, usually wayward moose are typically associated either with natural movements, because that's what young males do.
Yeah, I know that moose may have been the one that came through the Wilmer area, Candioi County area, and
it was. Yeah, I believe it was.
I go back, Lou, down to central Iowa near the Boone Ames area, back to the 1970s and through the mid 80s. We had a moose came right down Main Street of Boone, Iowa, early one morning, around 4 in the morning, 3 in the morning. The game officer called me up. And he goes, I know it's foggy, it's hard to see, but we know what we're looking at. There's a moose in town. That was the first I'd ever heard of that. And they had a story in Sports Illustrated on that moose. It died somewhere, or lost somewhere near St. Louis, I think, where it landed, and they couldn't find it anymore.
It happens. You think about the wayward mountain lion that every once in a while shows up. Those are invariably young males that leave their birth range and just start walking along river systems or creeks and end up in places that they shouldn't or wouldn't normally be. So you typically see that, especially with younger, year-and-a-half-old males. It's kind of what we do. It's like the teenager being kicked out of the house.
Yeah, young men, young males will do strange things, whether they're healthy or sick, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Not to totally divert, but when you mentioned mountain lion, I immediately thought of the man on the trail out in Colorado that had a little battle, a little dust-up with a juvenile mountain lion that to me is quite dangerous, because mountain lions have two things in mind, killing and eating generally, right?
Yeah, that's true. I spent a lot of years in Utah, in a western state, and we dealt with lions all the time. And it all depends on where you are. You live here, everybody's afraid of mountain lions. You live out in Utah, and everybody's afraid of wolves. So it all depends on what you're used to.
Mm-hmm.
But there's very few. There's very few attacks on humans, either from coyotes, wolves, or lions. But certainly that was an interesting one, and I'm glad it turned out the way it did.
For those of you just tuned in, we're talking with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Wildlife Research Manager Lou Cornacelli. Main topic here today is chronic wasting disease, because in the news recently again was a deer that tested positive just outside of Brainerd to the north a little ways, a small area, Merrifield. I see people worried in the medical field that this could jump to humans or get into humans. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think I'm certainly not a public health expert. I follow this stuff real closely, but I'm not a public health expert. But I think we certainly defer to the guidance of the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that you should not eat prion-contaminated venison. And for me, these prions are unnerving. Since they're not living organisms, since we know that they have jumped species barriers in the past, I think the risk is low. But if it's risk that you can eliminate, then why take it on? So I think, is there a possibility that it could jump to humans? Probably, maybe, likely, who knows? Uncertainty. I think I just used a word that's not a word, but I certainly defer to those public health experts. And if you look at the variant CJD, which was associated with mad cow disease, if you look at CWD, which some of the researchers who first described the disease think it might be a morph from scrapie, which is the seep variant. Anything's possible, and I think we should always be always, be precautious about how we approach any of these diseases. Like you wouldn't eat your venison without cleaning it, washing it first. Or you wouldn't eat hamburger at 115 degrees. So I think it's just normal precautions to limit overall risk.
Yeah, it's just a heck of a thing to think about. Gosh, and I know one thing for people's peace of mind, I guess, and for your information that's been done there are a lot of hunting zones, hunting areas where it's been required that you have your deer tested after you've harvested a deer during hunting season. Has that been a successful program?
It really has, and I think the other important thing to note is that a CWD test is not a food safety test. So I think it's, we're telling you whether or not the deer has the prion disease, and if it does, you probably shouldn't eat it. But it's not a food safety test per se, but it has. Our mandatory testing over opening weekend and our mandatory testing throughout the deer season in our CWD zone has been really effective. And I think we hear a lot of criticisms that people don't test their deer, they hate the DNR, and this, that, and the other thing. And granted, we don't have a ton of fans out there in many respects, but we have over 90% compliance in our opening weekend surveillance program. And hunters, people may not like it, they may not like the restrictions, but in this state, they tend to comply with regulations. And we also, we hear about the ones who don't, but the majority do. And the program is successful because I would fall on the sword and say the vast majority of people who use and enjoy deer don't want to leave a disease on the landscape, even if it means some short-term pain to get there.
Well, I would certainly want to know if a deer that I harvested had it or not. Gosh, the curiosity would be overwhelming to say, yes, here, let's check this out. And do the areas change every year on where you want testing done, or do they remain pretty similar? The short answer is it depends. So we do risk-based surveillance, which means that wherever we can identify higher risk areas, we test deer. And risk is associated with positive captive cervid facilities, in which there are 3 here in Minnesota right now. Risk is associated with how close the disease gets to our borders, and Wisconsin and Iowa are good examples. Or if we have opportunistic or suspect deer surveillance, somebody calls something in. So we look at it that way, and the reason we were sampling around Meeker County and where you are, in Wilmer and Crow Wing County and also in Winona County, was due to those 3 positive captive cervid facilities. So that's clearly risk. And also, again, Wisconsin and Iowa. So, we work in these areas for specific reasons, partly because it's a bang for the buck sort of thing. As of now, and this may change, but as of now, all of our surveillance has been paid for by people who buy hunting and fishing licenses. So when we do surveillance and we spend $1 million doing surveillance, that's $1 million that's not spent someplace else. Now there's a bill in the legislature to provide general fund revenue, which will help immensely in our surveillance program. But we just can't test every deer across the state. We don't have the staff or the resources to do that. So we look at it as an element of risk. Now, when you say surveillance, does that mean a multitude of different ways of counting deer, or seeing how many deer are near an area where you're going to do testing, air surveillance?
I guess I mix. When I say surveillance, there's multiple definitions. In this case, it's looking for disease. It's testing. It's forcing people through a check station and requiring them to have their deer sampled. So what we're trying to do is, with some measure of statistical reliability, find the disease if it exists in the population. So we do that by sampling X number of deer that are harvested, and the reason we work over opening weekend is because that's when most deer are killed. So we can run 500 deer from a permit area through the check station, and determine whether or not we have disease. And then when we do it for 3 years, that gives us more confidence that we do or don't have the disease. And we've worked very closely with taxidermists, because we know that adult males are more likely to have the disease than young females. So we have a taxidermist network where we do surveillance of those older 4, 5, 6-year-old males that are getting mounted for taxidermy purposes. So we really broaden cast a wide net for deer testing to say, hey, do we have the disease or not? And if we find it, that implements several steps in order to hopefully eliminate it because you found it early.
Could you take us through the process? Let's say I'm out, I get a large doe, and it needs to be tested. What do I do, and how long does it take?
Sure. So how long it takes depends on where you are. I'll get into that. But first thing I would always tell people to do is go to the Minnesota, our DNR website, mndnr.gov/CWD. It's full of information, has all the instructions, but that'll tell you where you need to go. So you kill that adult doe, you register it, and then you go to one of our sampling stations. So you pull into the station, you have the deer's head to the back of the truck so we can access it. We'll get some information. We'll pull the sample, which are 2 lymph nodes from the neck, and those samples will go to Colorado State University. And if you're in our disease management zone, that takes 3 or 4 business days to get a result. If you're outside a disease management zone, it takes usually about a week because we prioritize our results. Mm-hmm. And after that time period, you get on our website, you enter your number, and it'll show it'll show your disease that your deer was not detected. Now, if the deer's positive, you get a phone call long before it goes on the website. So if you don't hear anything from us, the deer's not positive. If you do hear something from us, you know before the rest of the public does.
Now, is this spread strictly deer to deer, or can other animals get involved somehow and spread it?
Right now it's deer to deer, but it transfers both directly and indirectly. And what that means is if a CWD positive deer, bumps noses with a not CWD positive deer, then the risk of infection goes up because you have direct. It'd be like if I have a cold and I sneeze on you, there's a good chance you're going to get a cold. The other way it gets transmitted is indirectly. So if a deer feeding over a common food source or a deer visiting a common, scrape that you made, so that's another way to get infected. So then the analogy there is if I have a cold and I sneeze on a door handle and you touch the door handle, you still might get sick. So it transfers both directly animal to animal and then indirectly through environmental contamination.
I read recently, I don't know if you caught this article or not, it's Field and Stream or Outdoor Life, and it had to do with people who are non-believers of CWD, if you can imagine that. Did you happen to catch that article at all?
I didn't see that one, but I've seen a lot of those articles, and I'll say that there's still people out there who think the Earth is flat and we shouldn't vaccinate our kids.
Right.
I don't fall into either of those categories. So I appreciate how passionate folks are about the disease, and but the reality is that the science strongly suggests the prion disease, and right now there's no cure. We hear about genetic resistance and how stray feed, which is the sheep version, has been eliminated or almost eliminated, and you can't compare domestic sheep with wild deer for one. And you can't really talk about genetic resistance in a wild population of animals. We're talking about trying to manipulate a wild population of animals that look largely the same. And the resistance thing, they're all kind of rabbit holes that folks want to go down because we're looking for something. And the reality is something we have right now is early detection and aggressive response. If a cure comes along in 50 years, then the work that we've done now is especially important. But right now we work with the tools that we have, and with that hope of not lasting, not having a lasting disease. And a lot of the stuff you read online, they're just falsehoods. I guess the term now is fake news, but they get traction because it seems like a nice shiny object to latch onto.
Yeah, social media seems to take traction no matter how wrong it is,
And trust me, I mean, I think about this a lot, and we get accused of hating deer, and we get accused of being bought out by the auto industry and by farmers, and most of us have spent our lives, working with these animals and the people who use them, and honestly, the last thing we want to be doing is working on these disease issues, but it's so incredibly important that we do it. But I never thought that after 27 years of working with big game animals that I'd spend the back end of my career arguing why they should be healthy, and it seems kind of it's difficult to do, and the stuff we're accused of is that we're really concerned about long-term deer health, and that's what it is.
Yeah, we all like to hunt. We all want to have it safe. We all want to have it be at the end of the day looking good on the wall or tasty, So
right.
it's what it's all about. And we'll want to have a nice herd of deer to look after.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it's a $1 billion industry, whether that's hunting or just recreational viewing and appreciating deer on the landscape. They're our most popular, game animal in the state, and I still think that if we buy into what the detractors are saying, that this is no big deal, and look at the other states where nothing's dying. If we buy into that, and 50 years from now we look like, like those other states, people are going to look back and say, "Why didn't you do something when you had a chance?"
Exactly.
And this is really our chance, and we put up with that criticism because we don't want what we've seen in other states to happen here.
Lou, just before we wrap up here, just a little bit about yourself now. As Wildlife Research Manager, you cover a lot more topics than deer, I would imagine, correct?
I do, yeah. I oversee 4 research groups, one of which is the Wildlife Health Program. Mm-hmm. So anything related to, you look at what the long-term bear research that Dr. Dave Garcelis has been doing, that falls in our group. All the waterfowl wetland work, that's in my group too. All the grouse. When you hear about the rough grouse drumming count, or the pesticide research that we're doing in a couple of our groups, that all falls under the Wildlife Research Unit, and our goal is to do a very applied wildlife research that helps inform management decisions. And the disease stuff is really top of mind right now. However, that it's a large group of about 30 people who perform at very, very high levels and answer these really tough management questions. Mm-hmm. And we actually have a social scientist on board who's looking at what we call human dimensions, which is really integrating those social science theories and applications into biological decision making. Because we know that most decisions we make as a wildlife agency are not pure biological. A lot of them are purely social with biological underpinnings or vice versa. So, we have this really big scientists in the Wildlife Research Unit who try and answer these questions and help us make good decisions as a state wildlife agency.
Yeah, it's interesting, Lou. 2 minutes ago, you mentioned the word bear. Now, I don't know if you've heard this or not, but we may still have a bear right here in our county, about 10 miles north of Wilmer, in the community of Spicer. A little backstory for you. Yeah, in November, it was videotaped crossing Highway 23 in the middle of Spicer and going to a residential neighborhood. Now, just a couple, 3-4 days ago, a lady called the sheriff's office and said, "Guys, I think the bear is still here." And, of course, they're asking why. And she goes, "Well, I have tracks, I have broken bird feeders, and my Christmas lights aren't lights anymore either. They remained up in the, whatever it is." She thinks the bear's still there living in the neighborhood. I don't know if she's seen it, but it was enough to have her call the sheriff's office. So well, the word hibernate's not coming into play here, I guess.
Yeah, they hibernate, but on nice days they'll come out a little bit too. Mm-hmm. So or if they get bumped from their den or from whatever nest they might have built above ground, they'll move around. But yeah, the bear story in Minnesota is really interesting because we being the people of the state of Minnesota we would define bear range as the forest. Well, bear range is wherever bears want to live, and we found out that bears are a lot more adaptable than we thought they were. And we have a good population in the Northwest. We have a population north of the metro and also in Pine County. So, and then we see these bears kind of expanding their range down towards the farmland. So bear range is where bears will live. So it's not uncommon to see bears and bear signs.
And
you wouldn't associate them.
I think we're ideal here because we have the woods, we have the water, we also have the farmland with some good food, and then we have people with bird feeders. So
yeah. Yeah, right. And if you look at northwestern Minnesota, you wouldn't look at that country and say, "Hey, this is really good bear habitat." Well, guess what? Bears moved into that area, and it's great bear habitat. They're doing fine, But if you look at in the forest, in like the Chippewa National Forest, where bears need a good mix of young forest because they're dependent on nuts and berries parts of the year. And when the forest gets really old, there's a decline in bear habitat. We've seen, that functional response in bears in some parts of the state on the national forest where that habitat's just not, conducive to bears anymore. But then you're seeing expansion in other areas. So bears are a really neat animal. They live a long time. They're really smart. They do neat things, and every once in a while they get themselves into trouble.
And here I thought from a former co-worker that bears only needed like 2-day-old bakery goods and a bag of Twizzlers, right?
Exactly. Yep, and a picnic basket.
Right.
So, but no, they're a neat animal.
As we're wrapping up here, are you moving in traffic yet, or are you still stopped?
No, I'm moving. I'm actually almost to the office finally.
Finally, almost.
Yeah, I live out in the country. I'm about 35 miles north of the central office. I think the work is where I work. Where I play is not there.
Wildlife Research Manager Lou Cornacelli has been our guest here today. My first efforts in chatting with you, Lou, and I want to hook up with you and any of your DNR associates here as we can talk about wildlife in the great state of Minnesota. It'll be a pleasure, and we'll have to hook up again, all right?
You bet. Just let me know.
Lou Cornacelli with the Minnesota DNR today.
You've been listening to Community Roundtable, a free public service brought to you on AM 1590 KDJS. If you're a member of a nonprofit organization and would like to be featured on the program, call the KDJS Newsline at 320-235-2900. That's 320-235-2900.